Hello everyone, my name's Gareth. I'm going to talk to you about the TOR network. Specifically, I'm going to talk to you about vulnerabilities in the TOR network, how you can de-anonymize people, and so on and so forth. A bit of background about me. I'm not able to work in PowerPoint. There we go. I'm a career academic. Academics seem to get a rather bit of a bad press, so hopefully I'm here to change your mind. When I volunteered for the talk, I got an email through from the person organising the talk saying, "You're not academics, please don't talk about fluff." So I was like, "Oh, well, I'm an academic." So hopefully I'll show academics in a different light, and I'm going to talk about some of the technical details about TOR, but I'm going to sort of drop in and out of the technical details. So if you're not a technical person, you can keep up, and if you are, hopefully I'll fill that need. I currently run the digital forensics course at the University of Portsmouth. I teach everything, as pretty much every lecturer does, from forensics through to cryptography. But most academic staff, if you've been to university, you see the academic staff teaching you. The academic staff typically also spend quite a significant portion of their time doing research, and this is doing publications and things like that. And my specific interest is in reverse engineering and memory forensics, but about 6 or 7 years ago, I spent a good 5 years or so doing research into very large, decentralized systems, not that dissimilar to TOR. So I'm going to talk to you today about how TOR works. I'll talk about how the actual infrastructure works, how the network works. I'm going to talk to you about how something called hidden services work and how you can de-anonymize not only visitors to hidden services, but hidden services themselves. I'll show you how you can de-anonymize users generally. And then I'll also talk about, finally, what's commonly known as the FPI exploit. If you've followed TOR, you'll know about this, and I'll show you the actual exploit itself and some of the shell code from it. As a show of hands, how many of you have used TOR? So that's what, about 80%. Keep your hand up if you run a relay. Keep your hand up if you run an exit. Oh, you guys deserve a round of applause. Yes, you really do. And if you're not quite sure why we're clapping these guys, in a few slides I'll explain to you why they deserve very much a clap, and why they may not be here next year. So I guess for a security conference, most of you have been following the Snowden leaks over the last year. I mean, it's been a rather interesting year to be involved in security in any sense of the word. And there have been, I think, about 3 documents leaked on TOR where GCHQ, the NSA, Five Eyes essentially had been working on trying to de-anonymize people from TOR and exploit the TOR network. I wanted to pick out one slide with a rather notable point which says that they can de-anonymize a small fraction of users but can't de-anonymize everyone. And that's essentially what I'm going to talk to you about today, is how some of the techniques you can use to de-anonymize people without cheating, essentially. But I'll also tell you how you can cheat, although that's not really what the talk's about. So just a primer for those of you who haven't used TOR. TOR aims to essentially provide a couple of properties. It's an anti-censorship tool, which essentially means if you live in a country which firewalls the internet or filters internet traffic, you can use TOR to bypass that internet filter. And I'll talk to you a little bit later about some of the countries which have done that and how we're trying to fix that. But the 2 primary features really that TOR offers are anonymity and privacy. A lot of people confuse these 2 terms and think they're actually the same thing. They're actually very different. Privacy essentially means that someone can't see what you're doing, but they may know who you are. And anonymity is, they don't know who you are, but they might be able to see what you're doing. Now, TOR provides both of these, but not necessarily at the same time. Right? It depends very much where you are. Now, I want to give you an example before we specifically talk about TOR. Perhaps the way initially that you may have wanted to get these 2 things online before TOR existed, or if you didn't know about TOR, was via a proxy or a VPN. You can go online and get cheap VPNs that sort of forward your traffic through Australia or some country with different laws to ours. Now, the way a VPN typically works is you've got you on the left-hand side here. So here's all the users connecting into the VPN. The VPN receives all of the traffic from the users and then spits it out to the different destinations which they want to be going to. Now, any observer looking from the outside can see, oh, that's what you're doing. I was wondering what you were doing. I thought you were talking to someone in the audience. Right. So you can, I thought he was talking to that guy for a long time. Why don't you just go and get him? Right, so you've got all the users on the left-hand side. They may be doing something on the internet. but typically the traffic from the user to the VPN or the proxy is encrypted in some way. So even if you're sitting on this side of the VPN and you can observe all the traffic coming from the user, you know who they are, but you can't necessarily see what it is they're doing. So all that sort of stuff comes in through this VPN, and if you can observe traffic coming out of the VPN, you can see what the people are doing, but not necessarily who they are. You can see they're visiting Twitter or WikiLeaks or Wikipedia and so on, but you don't necessarily know who they are. So anonymity provides privacy on the left-hand side, so before the VPN, so an attacker this side doesn't know what you're doing, but provides anonymity on the other side, because necessarily traffic in many cases to, for example, well, I guess it is now to Twitter, but I think it's even to Wikipedia, so these are probably really bad examples. But there's lots of sites, obviously, that don't use HTTPS, encrypted web traffic, so you can see what they're doing and what they're visiting on these websites. Now, of course, there's one really fundamental problem with this, and that is that if you own the VPN, or you can in some way compromise the VPN, then all bets are off, right? You can see which user is coming in and exactly where they're going out to which site. So the question is, which VPNs do you trust, or which proxies do you trust? Big question mark, there's loads of them. One's called Hide My Ass, of all things. Which one do you trust? They all put on their website, we don't keep logs, but there's many jurisdictions where you're required to keep logs, and just because they say they don't keep logs, why would you trust them? So TOR essentially attempts to solve this problem, where you've got this sort of entity which is forwarding your traffic, but you don't necessarily trust that entity in some way. So TOR is an open source project. That means you can go online and get the code. It means I can go online and get the code and change the code to do stuff, to try and poison the TOR network to do other stuff, which is fun, and I'll talk to you about that a little bit later. TOR essentially provides these two properties, the anonymity and the privacy, but at slightly different points in the network. So you'd think, okay, well, these are two things that really, say, for example, a nasty government doesn't want people to be able to do. So who sponsors TOR? Well, one of the big sponsors of TOR is actually the US government, even though TOR itself is a real pain in the arse for some aspects of the US government. So there's a bit of a funny thing. That's not to say that TOR is compromised in any way because of its funding stream. That's not the case, well, as far as I know anyway, and as far as many of us, I guess, probably suspect, but who ever really knows, it isn't compromised necessarily because of its funding stream. TOR has a couple of different funding streams, but one of the main ones is from the US government. And the US government want essentially there to be some sort of privacy and anonymity tool because they want to promote human rights. They want people in Syria and Iran and China and so on to be able to read websites which they shouldn't be able to do, to try and sort of bring democracy, as it were, on the world as a whole. Now, the idea behind TOR is that there's no single authority, there's no single person in charge of it, there's no single computer which is in charge with it. The responsibility for the TOR network is distributed over a large number of nodes. There are some authorities, which I'll talk about in a bit, but there's no single authority is the main point that I'm trying to take. Now, in the previous slide, I showed you that the proxy was that weak spot, right? That was the thing which, if you compromise the proxy or the VPN server, all bets were off. So TOR tries to sort of mitigate this risk. So here we've got an Alice called typical Alice and user Bob scenario. We've got Alice, who's our user. We've got a website or a person with whom Alice wishes to communicate called Bob. And instead of just going through one hop to get to Bob, she goes through several hops. So in this case, her messages, her requests for web pages, etc., are going through 3 individual nodes across the TOR network. The idea being that, to sort of read Alice and Bob's traffic, just controlling one of the nodes doesn't suffice. Just controlling one doesn't suffice. You need to be able to control more than one node from the TOR network to de-anonymize people or to view what they're doing on the internet. Now, the way TOR provides this is so here we've got, again, Alice, our user, on the far left-hand side. We've got our 3 hops through that TOR network. Now, typically, we call them the guard, the relay, and the exit. The guard node is the first hop from the user, so this is who the user talks directly with. That then goes through a second hop, typically called just a relay. In fact, all of these are relays, but a guard node is just a relay that's, in essence, just the first hop in the network. And then we've got the exit relay, which is where Alice's traffic exits from the network. Now, the way the sort of resilience, if you like, to compromise of a single node is provided is through encryption, sort of several layers of encryption. Layers of an onion, if you've ever seen the TOR logo, it's a picture of an onion. It was originally called onion routing, although it's sort of deviated from that a little bit now. So here we've got some data which the user wishes to send out to a web server all the way down this hand side. What this user does is she encrypts it to the first node, and then she takes that encryption to the first node and encrypts that, so wraps it in another layer of encryption to the second node, and then takes that and encrypts it in yet another layer of encryption to the final node. So what's actually coming to the guard node here is the data encrypted 3 times. This guard node can unwrap the outer layer, because it's been encrypted to him as one of the layers. So he can unwrap the outer layer and work out where next the traffic is going to go to. So in this case, it can forward the traffic onto B, but again, B sees the traffic, it's wrapped in 2 layers of encryption, it can only unwrap 1 layer of the encryption, and then it unwraps that, it tells you where it's going to next, and so on. And then it gets to C, can unwrap the last layer of encryption, which actually gives you the data, and then this final exit node sends it out to your destination. Now the idea here is that any individual node in this path or in this circuit only knows about the node before it and the node after it, and doesn't know about any other nodes in the circuit. So even if you built a very much longer path, you couldn't work out where those nodes were. So you weren't even sure which one's necessary to compromise. Now, let's talk about a couple of things. So, do you want to know what Diffie-Hellman is? So if I told you that the exchange of cryptographic keys was done with Diffie-Hellman, what would that mean? Who's talking?
It's unprotected against somebody maliciously in between negotiating.
It's not, no, because, sorry, it is because it's authenticated Diffie-Hellman. It's authenticated Diffie-Hellman, yeah. Perfect forward secrecy is the thing that I'm looking for. What that means is that if, for example, you were able to collect all traffic going through the TOR network and store it, you had a massive data center, I don't know who does that, obviously, store that over time, right? And then at some point in the future, you were able to find out one of the keys for the TOR node, one of the TOR nodes, you wouldn't be able to decrypt traffic going back into the past. And that's what you said quite correctly with perfect forward secrecy. This is a property of the Diffie-Hellman key agreement protocol, which is, I guess, comes under the umbrella of asymmetric cryptography along with RSA. RSA doesn't provide this, and that's why there's sort of a shift at the moment to try and push people to use Diffie-Hellman with our web servers and so on, because it provides this, you can't decrypt stuff going back into the past. It's a very nice property for TOR to have. So before I get on to actually doing the de-anonymized attacks and so on, for those of you that may have had sort of a loose experience with TOR, you might have visited the website, you might have used it once and thought, oh, this is really slow, I'm not going to use this anymore. And anyway, I'm not doing anything, I'm not trying to bomb somewhere or anything like that. Essentially, there's sort of a whole range of different sort of code projects associated with TOR. The core one, really the most important one, is the TOR core program. And this essentially does all the functionalities to be one of those nodes and to be one of the clients essentially connecting and using the network. There are a couple of other tools. If you've been onto the TOR website and you've downloaded something, the TOR browser bundle is probably what you've been directed to first. This is a web browser packaged with the TOR client, so essentially it makes it almost point and click to use the TOR browser, and it provides loads of other safeguards against some of the sort of easier attacks that we'll talk about in a few slides' time. If you used TOR like a couple of years ago, so perhaps going back 3 or 4 years, Vidalia was a control mechanism to control the TOR program. It gave a nice little GUI interface to use it and so on. Torify and TORSOCs are really nice. They're command line programs that allow you to route essentially any TCP application through TOR. So for example, you can route SSH traffic through TOR. You could route IRC traffic if any IRC network didn't block TOR, which most of them do, unfortunately. You could route IRC traffic through TOR and so on and so forth. So you can essentially take any application. That's really nice. At the university, you've got a lab. You can't SSH out of the lab because the firewall people are a bit crazy and they think it's dangerous. So you can go into the lab and you can run TOR and you can tell TOR, we've got a fascist firewall that only allows certain types of ports out, and it will try and route the traffic via a port which is allowed, and all of a sudden you can SSH out of things. Who's used TOR recently? Is TOR slow? Who's used TOR 10 years ago? Was TOR slow? Yeah, so if you used TOR 10 years ago, it was really, really slow. Now it's not so bad. You could probably get used to it using it every day if you chose to. And we'll talk about why you might want to a little bit later. ARM is just a command line version of Vidalia, so sort of an administration tool for relays and so on. Orbot is an Android client for TOR, so you can download that off the Android marketplace. You can make all of your traffic anonymous coming from your Android phone. You can browse the web anonymously and so on. Those of you that run an exit relay, what's Exonerator? If you don't know what Exonerator is, you probably should do. So if you run a TOR exit relay, which means you're this very last hop in the chain, anything a user does on the internet essentially through your relay appears to come from your IP address. Right, so you're running this, I'm running an exit relay, someone publishes a terrorist manual or something along those lines, the FBI sees the website, lo and behold, my IP address is in the logs showing that it was me that uploaded the terrorist manual to the website, right? Exonerator essentially is a database of all TOR nodes which ever run and whether they're allowing exit traffic from their nodes. So if you were ever to get arrested, now keep in mind those of you running an exit relay, I commend you for running an exit relay, right? I really do commend you for running an exit relay. However, has a real potential to screw up your day, right? I mean, you may sit there thinking in your chair, you know what, if the police come to my door, yeah, they're going to be, they think it might be me, but I'm just going to tell them I'm using TOR and they're going to go away. It's not going to happen, right? They're going to come to your house, they're going to take all your equipment, you're going to be under investigation for 6 months because it gets put in a drawer, no one looks at it for 6 months, and for that 6 months you're going to think, am I going to go to jail or not? It's really a really life-changing sort of consequence. And I know a couple of people who have run TOR relays who have actually essentially been through that situation. So, think very carefully before you run an exit relay. You don't have to run an exit relay, right? You can run any other relay and be completely safe, but if you do run an exit relay, you really are, well done, but oh my God. Not something I would do, right? And I'll talk, if we get some time at the end, I'll explain some precautions you could take, and maybe you guys can contribute some precautions you can take on trying to minimize the risk from running an exit relay. So Exonerator, if you ever get arrested, you can point the police at Exonerator, and they can look it up, and if they knew what TOR was, which they don't, they could tell you that you're on an exit relay, and then they just send you home and give you all your computers back, which they won't. So in terms of the TOR program, so as I said, the TOR program is the core thing. It runs on the Android, it runs on Linux, Windows, etc., etc. Essentially the same code base, just with some minor changes for the different platforms. The TOR program itself, depending on the configuration, opens up 4 ports which you can use. If you're using it as a client, essentially you're going to use the SOX port, which is just a SOX proxy. It's just a standard type of proxy. You can configure a web browser, to use it. You should use the TOR browser bundle if you want to browse the web, because your web browser will leak information. We'll talk about that in a second. And the 2 other ports, TOR port and the directory port. The directory port we'll talk about in a sec. The TOR port is essentially for all of the TOR traffic which is going across the network. And then there's this final port called the control port. Who knows SMTP and POP? If I give you a telnet terminal, you can type in SMTP commands, right? So if I told you the control port was essentially an SMTP-like protocol, you know essentially what I meant, right? You can type commands and in text, you press enter, it tells you okay or no. Right? Very, very simple protocol, and you can control TOR, you can tell it to establish different routes to the TOR network, you can change all the settings of TOR, and so on and so forth. So a really nice port to use if you want to fiddle around with TOR and get it to do some interesting things and do some research with TOR, and so on. So I took one of the slides out from some of the GCHQ NSA leaks from TOR. I actually think, I don't work for GCHQ and NSA, so I don't really have an insider view onto this. I think actually GCHQ and NSA are actually behind the state of the art in terms of where academics are, in terms of the state of the art for de-anonymizing TOR users. They're using, they've essentially got taps on, big pipes coming into and out of countries all across the world. They can see all the traffic, they can inject traffic, they can do essentially stuff which is cheating in my view, to de-anonymize people. So I said earlier, if you want to browse the web with TOR, don't configure your web browser, Google Chrome, to use TOR, use the TOR browser bundle. Now, one reason for this is if you're using TOR, right, you want to be anonymous, right? You don't want anyone to know who you are. Now, you might use Google Chrome to browse the web, and then a little bit later, you change the Google Chrome settings to go through TOR, so you'd be anonymous. But then your browser starts fetching the ads in the title bars of pages. Double-click ads, for example, they have a unique tracking cookie which identifies you. And some of the NSA slides showed, there's a list of nodes. Here they are using TOR, and here they aren't using TOR, and here's their double-click tracking ID. It's the same thing. Well, we know it's the same person. We know exactly what they're doing every time they go on the web. So the TOR browser bundle tries to protect you against these sorts of things. So that's a very simple way on how you can sort of de-anonymize people if you've got that sort of super access to the network, which really most people don't have. I put this in quote marks. I should have put this in quote marks. Dumb users or naive users, really, I should probably say. So, users going onto forums and calling themselves Gareth Owen, for example, as their username, and doing it through TOR. I mean, that's really dumb and stupid, but I'm going to give you an example of someone a little bit later who essentially did that. We know the NSA from the leaks is actively involved in exploitation. So we're going to talk about one of the exploits which they developed for Tor a little bit later. But essentially targeting either hidden service websites. Just because you run a hidden website, which I'll talk about in a sec, doesn't mean it's not doesn't mean it's invulnerable to sort of traditional exploits and so on. What primarily we're going to talk about is what we call traffic confirmation and correlation attacks. These are essentially what I would call fundamental weaknesses in Tor, rather than sort of round the edges types attacks, side channel attacks against Tor, which are essentially cheating, trying to exploit Firefox or things like that. I kind of consider those cheating, although I mean they're very effective. And if you're the NSA or GCHQ, then of course they work. So why wouldn't they use them? So looking at the sort of the NSA GCHQ slides, it suggests they've had some success at doing something called traffic correlation. Academia has had a much greater deal of success in sort of trying to de-anonymize people without doing any kind of exploitation or any kind of cheating on types of things. So I'm going to explain precisely what that is in a second. But first of all, let me explain to you how you build routes through the Tor network. How do you figure out what your hops are going to be through that Tor network? Well, essentially, if you run a Tor relay, when you first turn it on, it has to publish its information with a directory authority. There's essentially 10 authoritative directory authorities. They're essentially the gatekeepers, if you like, to the Tor network, and they vote on relays that register with them. So if you set up a relay, you register with one of the directory authorities, and then they all vote on that relay. So they observe it over a period of time. Some of them will try and establish circuits through them, and so on and so forth. And as they do this, they'll vote on the reliability of that relay for certain types of properties. Now, these directory authorities vote on this information, and this voted on information is called something mythical called the consensus, which is just essentially a list of relays in the Tor network which have been voted upon by these directory authorities. So they're kind of like the trusted, in inverted commas, relays, if you like. So the directory authorities vote on all of these relays and the properties which they've been assigned to them, and then each of them signs the consensus with a cryptographic key. And the public key component of this is embedded inside the Tor client, so anyone can verify if you've got a genuine copy of the Tor client, you can verify that the consensus is correct and what's in there is correct. Now, if you run a relay, each relay, am I talking too fast for you? Or? Let me slow down a little bit, okay. So, when you run a relay is just, it's just something which relays traffic, right? A guard node is a relay, an exit node is a relay is a relay, and so on and so forth. But what the directory authorities do is give each of the relays flags, so certain things which they should be able to do or certain properties which they've exhibited, and so on and so forth. So if you run a Tor relay and you run for 8 days and you offer a certain amount of bandwidth, sometime after 8 days, the directory authorities say, you're now eligible to be a guard node. You're now eligible to be that very first hop in the chain. And then over time, over the next sort of couple of weeks or so, people will start using you as that very first hop in the chain. Right? Likewise, if you run a Tor relay and you set Tor up so that you can allow traffic to come out onto the internet from your don't, you can allow traffic to come out of your things onto the internet, right? The directory authorities will vote you as an exit node and say, these nodes are eligible to be exit nodes. So when Tor clients select their paths, they'll say, okay, well, I'm going to select my first hop from this set of guard nodes. I'm going to select my exit node from the set of exit nodes, and I'm just going to pick one randomly from the remainder that are there. As I say, the directory authorities vote on these. They give them certain types of flags. And if you've been running for 8 days, you get the guard flag. If you allow exit, you get an exit flag. When would you get a bad exit flag? Yeah, so if you're running an exit relay, right, you can see all the traffic coming out onto the internet from your node. If you start trying to man in the middle SSL traffic, there's a script which runs through all the exit nodes periodically, trying to establish SSL connections out of the Tor exit nodes, and picks up essentially, fake SSL certificates coming back for the different things. So at the moment, or in fact, as of Sunday, there were exactly 7 bad exit nodes which have been flagged as bad exit because they're doing these SSL man-in-the-middle attacks. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, there were 25, so this sort of fluctuates up and down as time goes on. But in theory, your Tor client should never select a bad exit node as an exit node, right? It's because they've been flagged already. That doesn't mean there might not be an exit node which hasn't yet been flagged as one. There's a bit of a lag time with much of this. So let's talk about some obvious attacks in terms of de-anonymizing people. And I'm not talking about doing exploitation or stealing cookies or anything along those lines. I'm talking about fundamental weaknesses in TOR. So if we look at the TOR diagram for a typical circuit, if you could control all three of the relays, then rather obvious, right? You can de-anonymize people, you can see what they're doing. But what's slightly worse than that is if you control just the exit and the guard node, you can, with high probability, still de-anonymize people. What we're essentially doing is looking for traffic patterns. We're looking for packets coming in here that have, say, for example, 5 packets with these particular delays between them, for example, coming in the guard node. And then if we also control the exit node, we're also looking for that sequence of packets coming out the exit node, and then we're correlating them. Now, the longer you establish a connection through the TOR node, the higher that probability becomes that, in fact, you are the same person essentially doing that traffic. So it's very much a probabilistic attack. It's not saying it's definitely this person, but over time it becomes much, much, much closer to certain that it is, in fact, that person. So really, these are sort of what we call traffic correlation attacks. We're trying to match the traffic coming in and the traffic going out up. Essentially can be used by a very powerful adversary. I couldn't imagine one of those that has, could have taps everywhere, but essentially could be used by a very powerful adversary. Now, it's slightly worse in the case of the NSA and GCHQ, because if you've got taps and lots of pipes, in fact, you don't even need to run relays. You can just watch traffic going into an existing guard node and watch the traffic coming out of an existing exit relay. And in fact, you can intercept traffic here as well, which pushes the probability up even higher that, in fact, it's the same person. So when you've got a very powerful adversary, I don't want to say all bets are off. It's still the best thing we've got, but it's certainly not guaranteed. Now, the really interesting thing to note is here we've got 3 hops. Right? And if you edit the TOR source code, you can change the number of hops that your TOR client builds. And the natural way to think about it is, well, if 3 hops isn't enough, maybe I'll make it 4, or I'll make it 5, or 6, or 7, or 8. I'll have as many hops as I like in my particular circuit. But it turns out, in fact, actually, that doesn't decrease very much your chances of being de-anonymized. Because as I say, we're still doing correlation attacks. We're just doing them at the exit and the guard relay. It doesn't really matter how many hops are in the middle. It just changes the delays, essentially, between the guard and the exit node at the time it's taking the traffic to travel between the 2 nodes through the TOR network. So it makes it a little bit harder, but not really significantly harder. So the default case is to run 3 relays through a circuit, and that's generally considered to be sufficient, provided all of them haven't been, or no more than one of them has been compromised. So the question is, how do you get to be a TOR node in someone's circuit if you want to de-anonymize them? Like, say we're not a powerful adversary, I'm just me, and I want to start de-anonymizing one of you. How do I go about de-anonymizing one of you? I need to control the guard node, and I need to control the exit node to do this traffic correlation and de-anonymize you. So the question is, how do I get to be your guard node, and how do I get to be your exit node? Right? I can't tell you which route to take through the TOR network. But essentially, I can just run a large number of guard nodes and a large number of exit nodes, and just hope that by chance you happen to pick my guard node and my exit node, right? Just by chance, and then we can do the correlation attack and work out, in fact, if it is you. So TOR tries to make this a little bit harder, and tries to make it really a lot harder. As I say, if you control the guard node and the exit relay, we can de-anonymize you, right? So what TOR does is, it says, when you first start up TOR, you will pick 3 guard nodes, and you'll keep them for a really long time. And we're talking between 1 to 3 months, typically. You'll keep these 3 guard nodes as your guard nodes for between 1 and 3 months. That means that either on day 1, you're screwed because someone's got your guard node, or you're not, right? So with high probability, you're not going to be screwed right on day 1, and for those 3 months, you're essentially going to be safe. Now, the reason why they're kept for 3 months is because if I ran loads of guard nodes, and every time we established a new circuit through the network with different guard nodes, at some point, you're going to pick my guard node. Yeah? I can't de-anonymize all of your traffic, but I can de-anonymize the traffic you sent through my guard node at that particular point in time. So it's kind of like an all or nothing. We're either going to get you on day 1, or we're not going to get you at all. And the guard node tries to sort of provide this scenario, really. Is there any sort of way of fixing this traffic correlation? There is something called high latency networks where you might go on to www.google.co.uk, but you've got to wait until tomorrow to get the homepage. right? And that gives a much, much longer period before you're going to get the home page, and makes these traffic correlation attacks really quite impossible. Works fine with mail and those sorts of things. Well, it depends how urgent your mails are, I guess, but it works sort of okay with mail, but not with real-time traffic, where we want real-time traffic, sort of web traffic and so on and so forth. So high latency networks are essentially a partial solution to this, but not particularly practical. The alternative is we can start injecting traffic into the TOR network at different places. We can start putting padding in. So rather than just sending the raw traffic between this node and this mode might choose at random to inject padding traffic into the connection. This node might choose at random to inject padding traffic, and so on and so on and so forth. It's just dummy traffic. It gets dropped at the next node. Makes this traffic correlation much, much harder. At present, TOR doesn't do this. Primarily because it overloads the network with traffic, and traffic on the TOR network is really constrained at the moment. We don't have a huge amount of traffic capability, or bandwidth rather. So at the moment it's not done, but it could provide some resistance, but not really foolproof. So everything I've talked about so far is, okay, you can do the traffic correlation, it's probabilistic and so on and so forth. Now, I'm going to talk to you about something called, no I'm not, I'm going to talk to you about this first, and then I'm going to talk to you about hidden services. It's much easier to de-anonymize people with hidden services, when they use hidden services. I'm going to talk about censorship first though. So I said TOR can be used to bypass censorship. So if I'm sat in China and I want to read about a particular website which is blocked by the Great Firewall of China, I could use TOR, for example. I can route my traffic through TOR. China can't see what I'm doing because my traffic is encrypted through TOR. And as long as I exit out onto the internet in a different country to China, it should in theory be okay. So there are lots of countries which are trying to block TOR because of this, because it can be used to bypass the censorship. China is one of them. There are in fact 3 or 4 others. This is a graph showing the traffic out of a certain type of nodes out of the TOR network coming from China, and you can see there's a rather big drop at this point and never really quite recovers. China have been actively trying to block TOR, and they've tried a set of different types of techniques. One very easy way to block TOR is to just download this consensus of all of the routers and say, okay, well, I've got a list of all of the routers. I can just IP firewall them so that no one can contact them. Right? A very, very simple way to firewall all of the nodes out of China. And of course, we can download this consensus once an hour and just update the firewall rules. Very, very easy to stop people accessing TOR that way. So TOR has tried to counter this by introducing something called bridges. Bridges are nodes which don't appear in the consensus. They're essentially guard nodes. They're not, but essentially guard nodes which you can use to connect into the TOR network, but they're not inside the consensus, and they're not widely publicized. So what you do is you go onto the TOR website, and you have to enter a captcha, and you get given 1 or 2, I think there's 3 actually, I think you get given a list of 3 bridges which you could use to connect to the TOR network. Now you've got to go through a captcha to get that list, so it's very difficult to automate it. You can't, well, there was a guy actually just a minute ago, wasn't there, showing you how to break captchas. That's a bad example, right? I mean, it's harder, right? Harder with captchas. So the idea is, it's not publicly available, so or not easy to get the full list. It's very, very hard to get the full list. So in theory, you can't block all bridges. And in fact, I could ask a friend in the UK to run a bridge, not tell anyone else about it, and I could go to China, and I could use his computer to connect to the TOR node. It's not public anywhere, so it kind of allows me in. So China's got a little bit cleverer. So China has this thing called the Great Firewall. Well, I say it's called the Great Firewall of China. I don't think it's actually called the Great Firewall of China, but everyone calls it the Great Firewall of China. So I'm going to call it the Great Firewall of China. So the Great Firewall of China sits around China, sees all of the traffic coming out of China, and they do deep packet inspection, which means they look at the content of packets, the content of the protocols going across the net, and do things based on the content of this traffic. Right? A really sort of resource-intensive thing. So initially, China started just inspecting the initial connection into the TOR network. The initial connection into the TOR network is done over SSL, and they'd sort of look for sort of triggers inside that initial connection. It turns out that TOR initially had certain characteristics about the initial connection which were fairly unique to TOR. So China would use those as sort of an initial trigger, and then it would actually connect to that node. So say I'm in China, I connect to a node, and I connect to it over SSL, and I send these sort of unique triggers, these sort of saying, oh, that sort of like almost identifies it as TOR traffic, but not quite. And then I start sending my TOR traffic to it. The Great Firewall of China records that connection, and then about 15 minutes later, another computer in China will connect to it and try and start talking TOR. And if the computer comes back and says, yeah, I'm TOR, what traffic do you want to route? Then the Great Firewall of China blocks it. Right? This was spotted by some researchers a couple of years ago. This is a little graph showing how long after the initial connection to a bridge, the Great Firewall of China came in and actually scanned the node and tried to talk to TOR to it. And it was typically on 15-minute intervals throughout the following hour, depending on the load of, depending on the time of day. If China was particularly busy, they'd see traffic come out, they might add this node to a queue and say, you need to check this later on, and they'll have some computers somewhere else that would connect to it at a later date, within the next hour or so, and try and talk TOR, and if it was, they'd block it. And they just these researchers did some really interesting things. They sort of recorded all the IP address which TOR was connecting to all these bridges, and there was a large number of IP addresses. So it's definitely a nation state type thing. They also tried a couple of other things. They fragmented the packets. If any of you are doing sort of low-level networking stuff, you can break a packet down into smaller chunks via a process called fragmentation. It turns out that if you fragmented the packets, the Great Firewall of China didn't do fragment reassembly, so reassemble the packets and actually check the content of it, just ignored it. That's expensive, right, for a firewall where you're doing like a whole country. So they found you could fragment the traffic and that would let it through. There's also something, if you look through the TOR specs, TOR have a couple of RFCs type documents which they write, great stuff to send you off to sleep. But if you're sort of paying attention and you're spotting there's actually a section on there, something called authenticate, which means that when you first connect to a bridge, if you configure this option, the bridge will sit there and it won't do anything until you send essentially the correct password. You can send it anything you like and it will just ignore you until you send the correct password. So that means now the Great Firewall of China needs to know about the bridge in advance and needs to know the password for it to scan it and see, in fact, if it is a TOR bridge or not. But you can kind of see this is kind of end up going to be a cat and mouse game, where TOR's going to change something, China's going to catch up, TOR's going to change something. It's going to just keep going like this forever. So TOR project are implementing something called pluggable transports, where essentially you could have 1,000 different modules that implement TOR perhaps over a custom protocol, over an existing protocol, etc., etc. And users can just plug them into TOR and use a particular type of protocol to talk out of China, so it can't get picked up by the firewall. So let's get on to hidden services, because this is really the thing I want to talk to you about. Who's been to a hidden service? Okay, about 5 or 6 of you, right? I mean, there's some de-anonymization for you there. Busted, right? So here we've got Alice. Alice is our typical user. It's you who wants to browse the web and so on and so forth. And here we've got Bob. Bob might live in China and wants to run a political blog opposing the government, right? I mean, you don't want to run that on your own home IP address because the Chinese government is going to come and get you. So you want to run it in a way which no one can find out where you are. But if no one can find out where you are, how are people that want to talk to you going to find out where you are? Well, this is essentially what hidden services, they try to solve this problem. In the case of hidden services, we have a user visiting a website called Bob, and both are anonymous to each other. So Bob doesn't know who or where Alice is, and Alice doesn't know who or where Bob is. And you think, well, how can that possibly work? I mean, it's actually quite simple. So Bob, when he first sets up his web server, he establishes circuits to something called introduction points. So 3 nodes, which he picks randomly from the available TOR relays, and he picks 3 of them called introduction points, and he builds a circuit to them. So a typical 3-hop circuit to that introduction point. So none of the introduction points know who Bob is. And then Bob publishes the list of introduction points to a database, which we're going to talk about in a second, and then it's available in this database. Now, when Alice wants to talk to Bob, she goes to the database, she gets a list of introduction points, so she builds a circuit to the introduction points, and then essentially says, meet me at a rendezvous point, and then a rendezvous point is essentially another node in the network, and both Alice and Bob build a 3-hop circuit to this rendezvous point. The rendezvous point doesn't know who Alice is. The rendezvous point is chosen by Alice, but the rendezvous point doesn't know who Bob is because Bob's built a 3-hop circuit to the rendezvous point. And even if you could compromise the rendezvous point, it makes it a bit difficult to find those sorts of things out later. Now, what we're going to focus on is this database right at the very top. What is it that gets published in this database, and what can we do with it? Because this is one of the techniques we can use to de-anonymize people, is actually this database itself. Now, this database is not stored in one place. It is distributed across the TOR network, and there are thousands of nodes upon which this database is distributed. So there's no single place where the entire database is stored. Now, I'm going to digress a very little bit and explain something called distributed hash tables. Put your hand if you know what a distributed hash table is. Okay, so I'm not preaching to those who already know. Okay, so imagine the scenario, right? You have a list of files and you've got 12 computers. You want to be able to distribute these 12 files across those 12 computers, just for sort of load balancing in essence, right? You might have, each computer's got 20 terabytes of storage and so on and so forth, right? So you've got a list of files, you want to distribute them across 12 computers. Now the question is, how do you distribute them across 12 computers without having a single computer who's essentially in charge of allocating where it goes? And we don't want that in TOR, because TOR is a decentralized network. We don't want a single computer in charge. So the idea with a distributed hash table is we want to distribute these files across those 12 computers, but in a particular way. Now, one way might be, so, okay, well, we take the file name and we take the very first letter from the file name, and the very first letter from the file name dictates which computer the file gets stored on. And then if someone wants to retrieve the file at a later date, they generate the file name, they pick the first letter out, and that tells them which computer it's going to be stored on. There's a fundamental problem with that. How many files do you have beginning with Z? I mean, I don't know, probably not very many, right? I probably have a lot more beginning with G than I do with Z, for example. So it doesn't evenly distribute the files across those computers, which, if it's used for load balancing, that's essentially what you want. So the idea with a distributed hash table is, instead of taking the file name and using the first letter, we first hash the file name, and then that dictates which computer of those 12 computers is going to be stored on. Now, a hash function is what we call a pseudo-random function. The output from the hash function is random. In essence, it's randomly distributed. So even if I have Gareth 1 and Gareth 2, if I hash both of them, you get completely different hashes, right? So in essence, it essentially evenly distributes the files then across the computer. Now, TOR uses this for storing the descriptors for these hidden services. So this is a TOR hidden service website address. All of the TOR hidden service website addresses are .onion. Who knows what the bit is before the dot? They're like, oh, I can almost remember. The bit before the dot is essentially just a hash of the TOR node's public key. That's why it doesn't look like anything particularly useful. What we're going to do is we're going to store that somewhere on a large set of computers. Now, we want to try and do it in a way which we can allow computers to join the distributed hash table and to leave the distributed hash table, because that's what's going to work with a very large network like this. So what we do is we draw a circle, and this circle represents the hash space, as it were. So you can imagine the circle goes from 0 all the way around to FFFFF, right? 0 all the way around to FFFFF. And what we're going to do is we're going to map hidden services onto this circle, and then we're going to map nodes in the network onto this circle, and that will tell us which nodes are going to store the particular types of stuff. So we take that hidden service address, we map it onto the circle by, it's between 0 and FFF essentially, and then we take our relays in the network, we map them onto the circle, and the way TOR works, it says, okay, well, the hidden service is going to be stored on the 3 nodes to the right in the circle. So we plot the circle, which you can do because you've got a list of all the relays, and you pick out the 3 nodes to the right, and you're going to publish your descriptor to those 3 nodes to the right. And then you're also going to store it in a different part of the circle as well, just by changing the hash a little bit, so there's a little bit of redundancy. And that essentially means now nodes can leave and join the circle without essentially causing this hidden service to go completely unavailable. So I'm going to skip over this because I think we're short on time. We did a bit of an experiment earlier this year. We had a bit of spare time, so we thought, what would be an interesting thing to do? So we thought we'd look at TOR hidden services with a big question, is TOR hidden services evil, for example? Is the content on them really bad? So we thought, wow, it'd be really great to look at TOR hidden services and find out just exactly what is on TOR hidden services. So my initial thought was, well, we'll take some of the directory sites, we'll point a web crawler at it, and we'll collect all the results. But I thought, well, the nature of TOR hidden services, some of them aren't going to be in directories, we're not really going to collect the full list. So we thought, okay, well, we need to collect the full list of all of the nodes. We know it's stored in this distributed hash table. So in theory, if we put ourselves on the distributed hash table at different points, what actually happens is, I've said the TOR hidden service appears here, it actually changes day by day. So every 24 hours, the position on the circle changes. So in theory, if I just sat at one position in the circle, given an infinite amount of time, I'd collect all of the hidden service addresses, and I could start looking at them and seeing what's contained on them. So actually what we did was we ran 40 nodes, we distributed them around this circle at different points, and we just sat and waited. Right? We just sat and waited for hidden services to register with us. We stored them in a database. But what we also able to collect, if you think about it, hidden services are publishing to us, but also people are coming to us to ask for the hidden service descriptor. So not only can I register the publication of the .onion address, but I can work out how many people are visiting it as well. So I can work out the number of hits as well. I can't view all the details on who it is because it's encrypted, but essentially I can register hits and I can register all the onion addresses. What do you think I found? So we've got a database. There's around about 50,000 onion addresses which have been published to our servers over the last sort of 3 months. I think there's probably about 10,000 more which we haven't yet collected. It just takes a little bit of time to collect all of these things. Does anyone know what Cepnet or Skynet are? Botnets, essentially, they're botnets. There was a presentation at Black Hat a couple of years ago on using TOR hidden services to run botnet command and control servers. Thinking, well, you can't trace the website, so you can't shut it down, so it'd be a really good place to run botnet command and control servers. And ever since then, loads of people have started writing botnets that use TOR essentially to host these things. It turns out the top 40 results are essentially botnet command and control servers. And you can see the top one there had 1.4 million hits a day. A day, right? That's a day, right? And this particular botnet, Cepnet, doesn't just have one TOR hidden service address, it's got loads, right? So it's not just 1.4 million hits a day, it's actually much, much larger. It's pretty close to 5 or 6 million hits a day. And we picked up a couple of others. Skynet is a rather notable one. The botnet master who runs Skynet did something called an AMA, which I'd never heard of, on Reddit, which is, I don't know what it stands for. Ask me anything, right? So you can go on this Reddit site and ask people anything. So the guy that ran the Skynet botnet went on this Reddit thing and asked them, you can ask me anything, right? He's a really foolish kind of guy anyway. It turns out anyway, he got locked up in December December last year. I'm not really sure why, but and he was on Twitter as well. Who runs a botnet and is on Twitter? Seriously. So we've also sort of ranked the other sets of sites as well. If you've been involved in TOR, you'll know that some of the TOR content is really not very nice stuff. Unfortunately, straight after botnet stuff are a particular class of abuse sites. We ran a crawler which didn't fetch any images, it just fetched HTML content, and this sort of stuff was easily identifiable using keyword searches through the images. Unfortunately, this is the second most popular stuff that we collected by in terms of hits, so the number of people visiting these sites straight after botnets. And then straight after that came essentially directories linking to other TOR hidden sites, some forums, some sort of like, I guess what I class as hacktivist type websites, those sorts of things. And there's a couple of search engines in there as well. If anyone's interested in looking at the full database, I'm quite happy to show it to you later, and you can see if you've got a particular onion address you want to look at and how many hits it got, for example, per day. I'm quite happy to show you that. So how about de-anonymizing TOR hidden service users? People visiting TOR hidden sites, right? In many ways, you think this is the holy grail, right? We've got really dodgy sites and really dodgy people visiting the really dodgy sites, right? So if we can work out who they are, then, well, hey, right, win-win. It turns out it's actually really easy to de-anonymize people visiting TOR hidden services. Really, really easy. So let's look at how a TOR hidden service connects to a TOR hidden service. Sorry, a user connects to a TOR hidden service. A user has a guard node. We've got the hidden service directory, which is that distributed hash table spread out throughout the TOR network. And then we've got the TOR hidden service itself, which again is separated from the network by the TOR network. So when I want to visit this website, I go into the TOR network through my guard node, and I connect up to the hidden service directory and say, can I have the descriptor for that TOR hidden service, the list of those introduction points where it's available? Yeah, and the hidden service directory sends it back to me. Now, think about this just for a second, right? I can position myself on that distributed hash table so that I'm the node responsible for a particular website. Right? I can position myself wherever I want to be so that I know I'm going to be receiving requests for a particular type of website. So I now control one end of this connection. Right? The user is talking to me, right? And I know that they're looking for a particular type of site. And you can think of these as kind of like these requests for these descriptors perhaps very similar to DNS requests in respect. If I get a request for one of these sites, they're doing it at the initial point of wanting to visit the website, just like you would do with a DNS request. So I can send the user whatever I want. Right? I should probably send them the hidden service to which they asked for, which I'm going to, right? But I can shape the traffic in a particular type of way. Right? So I could send them, just 20 packets, for example, or I could put it in 30 packets, and so on and so forth. So if I control just the hidden service director node and the guard node, stay with me on the guard node point, right? I can send traffic back down this pipe with a particular characteristic, and I can spot that characteristic on the guard node, and I can de-anonymize someone that's visiting a particular website. I can't tell what they're doing on that website, but I know who they are in essence. Now, the question is, how do I control the guard node? Well, think back to that GCHQ slide I showed you on the very first thing where I said we can de-anonymize some people some of the time, but it's very difficult to de-anonymize someone specifically, right? So if I want to de-anonymize you, it's very hard for me to do that. But if you're all visiting a Tor hidden website, the chances are that some of you are going to be going through my guard node, and I can de-anonymize all of you. Yep, I know exactly who you are. Now, some of you are sitting there thinking, really? Really? I've been using Tor, I thought it was foolproof, right? Here's a Google map of everyone visiting a particular website, a particular Tor hidden service, right? This is all their original IP addresses run through a GeoIP database and plotted on a map, right? I mean, it's that easy, right? Really that easy if you control the guard node, and just by the rules of probability, at some point, you're going to control the guard node for some of the users, right? So this was actually for a botnet. This wasn't me, this was someone else de-anonymized them, but it was essentially for a botnet. And the guy theorized that, at the time, Silk Road was quite popular, so you could de-anonymize everyone visiting Silk Road, and you could say, well, people selling drugs and people buying drugs are going to have different behaviors. Really, we want to go after the sellers, and they're probably going to log in, once a day, twice a day, 3 times a day, but it's going to be fairly regular every day type thing. So just on the frequency they visit the websites and how often it was, you could probably figure out whether they're a buyer or seller, and then selectively raid just the buyers rather than the sellers. So how about de-anonymizing the Tor hidden service itself? Right, can we use the same technique to de-anonymize the Tor hidden service? So again, right, the user can send data to the Tor hidden service, right? So we control one end of the connection, right? The Tor hidden service is talking to me, and I can connect as many times as I like, right? So if I'm the user and I control one of the guard nodes the hidden service happens to use, then I can send a signature of packets down through the network, and I can watch from the guard node, and if I see them, that tells me that's probably the hidden service running that particular hidden, the server running that particular hidden service. And think, okay, well, what are the chances of you ever being the guard node for the hidden service? The hidden services keep them for 3 months typically, between 1 and 3 months. It's quite hard. Some guys have shown that, in fact, even with moderate resources, sort of like £5,000 or £6,000 in server capacity, on average, you can de-anonymize a hidden service in 8 months. And actually work out who they are, right? It's really not that difficult. So let me just backtrack very, very quickly. Right? The signature we actually send is so that here the hidden service node, or whatever it is, sends a particular sequence of packets to the user. Now, the guard node can't decrypt that traffic, but what we found is that if you send, for example, just 50 packets, so you send exactly 50 packets, you can pick up the number of packets going down a particular circuit at the guard node, and you think, okay, well, what are the chances of there being another connection with exactly 50 packets coming through? You might think it's pretty high. Well, some researchers in Luxembourg essentially set up 300,000 connections that didn't do this and found none of them had exactly 50 packets, right? So it's still a probabilistic attack, but it's a very high level of probability that it is in fact the right site or the right person doing it. And you can imagine doing it over a couple of months. You see the person coming back and coming back and coming back. It gives you a high degree of probability. Big question mark over whether that would be sufficient to get a warrant and seize someone's computer. I don't know whether it would or not. I've certainly not seen any test cases on this. I don't think the police are even doing this. I certainly don't think GCHQ are doing it at the moment. But it's certainly possible. This is a fundamental weakness in TOR. This is a problem that's also very difficult to fix. Right? Very, very difficult to fix. Padding is one way to try and mitigate the risk, but it doesn't really solve the problem completely. So just the final thing I wanted to get onto was Silk Road. I started to talk to you about the FBI exploit itself. Silk Road was essentially eBay for drugs. Right? The sellers were selling drugs and the buyers were buying drugs. And it was a Tor hidden service which was essentially facilitating this. And the guy running Silk Road was essentially taking a bit of profit from each transaction, much like PayPal might do, right? Really a real business entrepreneur, just with the wrong business really, to sort of make money. So it's sort of estimated that Silk Road over its lifetime had around just over £1 billion in revenue, and that this chap that ran it had about $8 million in profit, all in bitcoins though. And if anyone knows how to cash in exactly $80 million of bitcoins, please come and tell me without causing a crash in the price of bitcoins. I don't know how you do that. But he had £80 million worth of bitcoins, and he lived in a dinky little flat in San Francisco somewhere. The FBI actually tracked him down, not by a weakness in TOR, but but actually just by sort of traditional detective work, it turns out he'd been on a forum advertising his website, and he'd signed it Ross Ulbricht, or Ulbricht, whatever his name is, on the forum, and they'd sort of over time just sort of collected this information, correlated it all, and identified him. They'd sort of identified where he was going to. They'd also managed to pick up a few other things which gave them a high degree of confidence that it in fact was him that was doing it, and they actually arrested him in a library in San Francisco. Essentially caught by his own foolishness. And in fact, one of the FBI agents at the time posed as an assassin because he was trying to get someone assassinated. No honor amongst thieves, really. So I don't know if you can see that, yeah. So the FBI, we now in fact know it was the FBI because of the court papers that have been released. The FBI took advantage of this. Silk Road was run on a set of servers called, that were run by an organization called Freedom Hosting, which ran a whole range of hidden websites. So the FBI, in their ingenuity, thought, we've got an opportunity here. We've got Freedom Hosting servers. They host actually some really viral content as well. So we could de-anonymize people from, actually visiting these websites. So it's a bit unclear as to who exactly developed the exploit itself. It's either GCHQ or NSA or a combination of the two, and then they helped the FBI deploy it. But essentially, they took the Freedom Hosting websites and they put a 0 day in the web page. And then anyone that visited the website running the TOR browser bundle, a particular type of version, Firefox would run that exploit, and it would feed back their details back to the FBI server and essentially de-anonymize them. Essentially, a couple of guys caught it a few days after, and there was a JavaScript exploit in the thing. It's essentially exploiting a very complex bug in the way Firefox works. I'm going to talk to you more briefly about about the shellcode itself, because that's really the thing that's interesting. The big question, of course, is this legal? Is it legal to exploit a large number of people on a large scale, some of whom are doing something quite innocent? Freedom Hosting hosted some innocent websites, incidentally. If you're sat home, right, and the FBI exploit your computer and you haven't done anything wrong, is that legal? Does anyone go to jail for that if they do that? I mean, probably should, right? I mean, I don't think they will, though. This is the reason we know that GCHQ and the NSA were involved. One of the leaks from Snowden actually referred to it. It was called egotistical giraffe, the actual exploit, presumably because TOR uses egotistical, presumably because giraffe's got a high head, which shows where it is, I presume. So I just wanted to show you the shellcode very briefly. I've also put on this web link here is a copy of the shellcode, an annotated copy of the shellcode, and a sort of a walkthrough in text, if you're not familiar with reverse engineering, on exactly how it works. If you look at the JavaScript code here, you can see a long list of hex characters in a string. I mean, that's characteristic of shellcode for these types of exploits. And if you take that code out just as a guess that is in fact the shellcode and disassemble it, it does turn out to be shellcode. So when you run it through a disassembler, this is what you get. So this is run through a disassembler called ndisasm, and if you ever disassemble shellcode and you're not really that familiar with disassembly, you'll be like, what the hell? I have no idea what's going on, right? There's no strings, no exe to load up, no DLLs being loaded, or anything like that. You just see like a blob of instructions. You're like, what the hell's going on? So I'm just going to very briefly talk you through how you reverse engineer it, and then we'll finish up. So the thing with shellcode is shellcode's injected into another program. Right? So normally when you've got an exe file, the exe headers say, bring in this DLL and that DLL, so you know where all the DLLs are in memory, so you can run, and call the Windows API and so on and so forth. Shellcode doesn't have that luxury. It's injected into a process. It doesn't know precisely where all the DLLs are. So it's very common to have something called an API resolver embedded in the shellcode, and you call this API resolver to find out where different Windows API functions or where the DLLs are loaded, so you can actually call them. And it's fairly common to see this sort of pattern where you push a series of hex digits, typically 8 hex digits, and then make a call to a register. That pattern is quite common in shellcode. The register EBP points to the shellcode resolver, and the hash, or rather this number here, actually describes which API function we're actually calling. So the process of reverse engineering the shellcode is essentially saying, okay, well, find out which API resolver is being used, and then look up these hash functions and go through and comment them and say, this is this API, that's that API, and so on and so forth. And then you end up with something like this. So this is the same shellcode. The only difference is I've added some comments to the right-hand side on exactly what's going on. So there's that hash, there's that call to the API resolver, and this hash essentially maps to WinSock, which is the sort of internet connection, DLL, and the connect function. So we know at that point that it's establishing a connection out onto the internet somewhere. The question is, where is it establishing a connection to? If you've ever written any C code, you know when you do a connect, you have to set up that horrible SYN address structure, and it's not the prettiest thing in the world, is it? But that, of course, is going to be where the IP address is stored. So typically, when you see a call, the parameters are pushed onto the stack just before it, and one of these things which is pushed on is just that SYN address structure. So we find it in memory. There's the SYN address structure. It looks like a series of bytes, but when you know what the SYN address structure is, you can comment the shell code and say, okay, well, this is the IP address, that's the port, and this was the IP address. It was registered somewhere in Vancouver, I think. Not Vancouver, VA. What's VA, the state code? Virginia, that's it, which is not that far from one of the contractors for the FBI, incidentally. But we're not quite sure who was running it, right? I mean, you look at the whois stuff, you know, who's running it. But the interesting thing is what the shell code did, right? I mean, most shell code is going to try and get some sort of persistence, install some malware on the computer. That's the typical pattern for shell code. This shell code doesn't do any of that, right? It literally phones home. So it contacts the FBI server or whoever service it was, and it sends them your MAC address, your computer's host name, and a unique reference number, aka everything that could be used to identify you, right? And then it stops, right? That's not how malware typically works, right? I mean, that's, you know, if you're running a business, right, you're not going to make out money by collecting people's MAC addresses. It's not going to be particularly profitable. So I can't remember whether I put this on the website, but it's fairly easy to patch this code. If you look here, there's the offsets for the data, and you can just patch the IP address by changing the bytes. You can patch the port, you can run netcat, and then you can execute the shell code, and the shell code will send just a HTTP request. So here was a GET request made to the FBI server. This appears to be some sort of unique reference number, possibly which links you up with a particular visit to the TOR hidden service. So they could identify which TOR hidden service it was you went to, at what time, etc., etc. And then in the header, you've got this cookie ID equals, this is actually your MAC address, and the host is set to your computer's host name. Everything which ties you up, essentially, right? The FBI now have your IP address, they have your MAC address, they have your computer's host name. You know, if they can't trace you via your IP address, they might be able to trace your MAC address through the supply chain, etc., etc., etc. You're done for, right, essentially. So as I say, the website there, the full source code there, and everything if you want to have a play with it and have a look around it. How to help with the TOR project. I put the first one as use TOR. Right? Most of you are sitting there thinking, why the hell do I need to use TOR? I'm not some terrorist or doing anything dodgy, right? Well, actually, there are people that really need TOR, people in Iran, China, Syria, etc., you know, who really depend upon TOR. If you use TOR, right, it makes the noise bigger, right? They're in amongst the noise. If only bad people use TOR, then, you know, simply by looking at TOR, you catch all the bad people, right? I mean, it's like a honey trap type thing. But obviously, if genuine people use TOR who aren't doing anything wrong, it sort of mixes them against the noise and makes them essentially more anonymous. Consider running a TOR relay. You don't need a huge amount of bandwidth. Most people can run it quite comfortably on their home broadband without any ill effects in terms of, you know, reducing their bandwidth availability. You know, can easily run a couple of 100 kilobytes or 100 kilobits, you know, relay at home without it really impacting you. Don't run an exit unless you really do like pain or law enforcement visiting you at 6 o'clock in the morning. Personally, I don't like early mornings, so that would really peeve me off, along with the investigation as well, obviously. Consider developing for TOR. TOR is an open source project, so you can contribute to it and you know, really sort of contribute to it, or you can develop alternative projects like, you know, like there's the TOR browser bundle, there's Vidalia, etc., etc. These are sort of like accessory TOR projects which you can contribute to or build or build other types of things. Consider donating. You get a free T-shirt if you donate $60, which I don't think that's great value for money. But incidentally, if you want a T-shirt, you can run a TOR relay for 2 months and you get a free T-shirt that way. So that's the way I've chosen to go. Promote it, right? Come and give talks about TOR. Right? It's a really great thing for people in countries where, you know, actually really is a matter of life or death for them to be able to use TOR. Or consider doing research on TOR, making it better, right? I mean, I don't want to de-anonymize people from TOR for fun, right? I want to make TOR better, and the only way you make TOR better is by breaking it and then fixing it, right? You know, unfortunately, I just don't know how to fix it very well. So, you know, there we go. Any questions then? Let me just say, if you want any code, right? Here's the link to my GitHub. On there is the modified TOR client, which collects all of those hidden service addresses. There's loads of scripts, a crawler, etc., for going through all the hidden services. And then there's a link for the FBI TOR thing. Any questions? Sorry, I've broken into your break a little bit.
Just a contribution. There's another software out there called Tails.
Tails?
Tails, T-A-I-L-S, which is basically...
Oh, Tails, sorry, yeah.
A USB or CD-ROM, whatever ISO, and just running off, and immediately starts off computing.
Yep. So there's a live CD version of Tor called Tails, which is a Debian distribution with Tor built into it, such that traffic can only go via Tor or not at all, right? So that means that if, for example, the FBI had written an exploit which worked against Firefox for Linux, then you would have been invulnerable to it because that sort of phone home would also have gone through Tor as well. So yeah, very good point is the Tails thing as well. So if you and of course Tails doesn't log anything as well. So if you don't want to get caught after the fact when your computer sees, you can use Tails as well. And any other questions then?
You run an exit relay back into Tor. So
What?
Tor in Tor
Why would you want to do that?
to anonymize something.
Run an exit relay into Tor.
Yeah.
I don't see the value. I don't see why it would be useful. Sorry. There's another question, was there? No. Yeah.
So the callback GET request, have you seen the response? Was it just a blank response?
No, because by the time I got to it, the server had gone down. So, I mean, that would have been a bit more useful. Could you exploit the FBI? No, that's not a good idea, is it? I don't know if there would have been no value. There was no response process in the shellcode, so there would be no value in the response itself. No, but that would be an interesting thing. So Tor, just leave you. Tor is a really great project. Please support it. Right, it really does help people that are really in really nasty countries. It's also a tool for us, right? If you really care about anonymity and privacy, right, is really the only real solution we have at the moment that really works.
Do you have any ideas? You said you're not very good at fixing it, but do you have any ideas from playing with it as to how you might fix the entry-exit issue?
So, I mean, the only way that I know, there's two ways essentially you can fix it. One is by adding padding, but that overloads the Tor network, and there's very constrained capacity available on the Tor network. It doesn't really fix it completely; it just makes it much harder. And the other one was on a high latency network, which again, who's going to use Tor if it takes a day to get a web page? So.
Can't you use VPN on the exit node so you can protect yourself when you're...
Yep, you can route all TCP traffic through Tor. So a standard VPN, well, a TCP-based VPN, you could easily route through the exit node. Then do you trust your VPN provider?
Well, it's still we have to compromise the end node and the...
Yeah, I guess yeah.
The same thing for the guard node.
I guess from my point of view, you kind of assume that you've got a very powerful adversary, and that if you're going to use a VPN through Tor, if you see what I mean, you're just kind of moving the goalpost a bit. You're not really fixing the fundamental problem.
Yeah.
If you see what I mean, that's
I'm just saying as a...
yeah, that's sort of as a quick solution maybe, yeah. But I mean, I don't really trust VPN providers personally, but there you go.
Can I ask then, in terms of guard nodes and so on, what was shown before was that a lot of the capture was going on an international service. Is there any value in geolocation element?
Oh.
You get the opportunity to geolocate or think about geolocating where you're picking your service.
So that's a very good point. So when the Tor client picks a circuit, any two nodes in the Tor circuit aren't allowed to be in the same /16 subnet. So you could say it's probably not true nowadays, but a /16 subnet is maybe one IP, one ISP, a couple of ISPs. So Tor tries to minimise the risk by separating it across, make sure that two nodes aren't in the same subnets. They're much less likely to be controlled by the same adversary. You can configure Tor to pick entry nodes in a particular country and exit nodes in a particular country, which would, might be useful in some circumstances. There's a lot of configuration you can do with Tor to do interesting things.
How do you see things like the Open Technology Initiative working in conjunction with Tor to help?
The what, sorry?
Open Technology Initiative?
I'm not familiar with it, I'm afraid. I'm not familiar with it.
It's similar to what Tor was in government-backed product to anonymize data in countries like that.
Okay. There is an alternative to Tor called IPP. I think it's IPP or I2P, something like that.
Network, and the network where anonymous mesh wireless networks, so creating those and complementing Tor.
I mean, any solution which helps these two aims, the privacy and anonymity, has got to be a good thing. Tor, I think, is the state of the art at the moment in terms of technical solution. Certainly, in my view, I may be wrong on that. But, yeah.
Would running your own page node and then connecting into that provide a layer of deniability?
Of course. Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe, right? I mean, generally it's a bad idea to mix your traffic with other people's traffic. If you run an exit relay and you also browse the web via that same address, when they come after you for doing bad stuff, you can say, well, I'm running an exit relay, but do you browse the net through your address as well? Yeah. So, there's still, it's general.
If it's a bridge node and it's the entry node, the guard node,
Yeah, I see your point. Maybe. Question mark. I'll think about it more. Any other questions? All right, yeah.
For the hidden services, when we compromise the node in the distributed hash table, couldn't we use like a consensus so the user will trust that the connection didn't come from compromised node?
So for the distributed hash table, the way it works is, if you've been running for 25 hours and you offer more than, I think, 50 kilobits of bandwidth, you're eligible to participate in the distributed hash table. So the idea is that by requiring 50 kilobits of bandwidth and requiring you to be on for 25 hours, it kind of increases the amount of resources an attacker needs if they want to put a large number of nodes on the distributed hash table. Clearly doesn't stop it because we've got 40 nodes, but we've only got 40 nodes because a student runs a hosting company and had loads of spare capacity and was like, here you go, have that, stuff, but it makes it much more difficult. There was an attack from the University of Luxembourg which showed that you could actually fake nodes onto the distributed hash table without using very much resources at all, but they told the TOR project about it and they fixed it. So, it's at the moment quite expensive to run a large number of nodes on the distributed hash table.
So yeah, that's my point, because it's expensive and we are using consensus to respond to the user. An attacker would have to compromise lots of machines to be able to get this. Depends on how much faults we're tolerating in the consensus.
Yeah.
One fault, you have to use 2 malicious machines.
Yeah. I think there's lots of things we can do to make it a lot more difficult, and TOR does do quite a lot of things to make it, generally, I guess, over TOR it more difficult, but it is a process of making it more difficult rather than impossible, if you see what I mean. So, okay, thank you very much.